Sometimes the earth itself whispers secrets to those who truly listen. In the heart of rural Alabama, where the red clay earth stretches endlessly under scorching summer skies, something extraordinary was about to unfold. But before I tell you what changed everything for one desperate farmer, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like the universe was trying to tell you something? Like there were signs all around you, waiting to be discovered? What I'm about to share with you happened just last year, in a place where hope had almost died. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about fate, about miracles, and about how sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst nightmares. Picture this. A man so poor, he couldn't afford to fix the holes in his work boots. A farmer whose land had been cursed by 3 consecutive years of drought. A father who went to bed every night wondering how he'd feed his family the next day. His name was Thomas McReady, and for 43 years he'd worked the same 80 acres that his grandfather had left him, land that had once been fertile and green, but now looked more like a graveyard than a farm. The morning it all began, Thomas woke up to something he hadn't heard in months, the sound of his cattle moving restlessly in their pen. But these weren't the lazy movements of animals grazing. No, this was different. This was urgent, panicked. It was still dark outside, maybe 4:30 in the morning, and Thomas could hear them stomping and bellowing like something had spooked them badly. As he pulled on his torn jeans and grabbed his flashlight, Thomas had no idea that within the next few hours, his entire world would be turned upside down. He had no idea that what he was about to discover would not only save his farm, but would also challenge everything he believed about luck, destiny, and divine intervention. You see, Thomas McReady was a man who had given up on miracles. After watching his crops fail year after year, after seeing his neighbors lose their farms to the bank, after counting every penny just to buy his children a decent meal, Thomas had convinced himself that God had forgotten about people like him. People who worked 18-hour days and still couldn't make ends meet. People who prayed every night but never seemed to get an answer. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. As Thomas stepped out of his small farmhouse that morning, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, in the middle of his largest field, the one he'd planned to plant with corn if he could ever scrape together enough money for seeds, were marks in the earth. Not just any marks. Perfect geometric patterns, as if someone had drawn them with mathematical precision. Circles within circles, lines that seemed to point toward something specific. The cattle weren't just restless, they were terrified, and as Thomas walked closer to those strange markings, his heart pounding against his ribcage, he realized that his animals weren't the only ones who sensed that something was very, very different about this morning. The air itself felt charged, electric, like the moments before a lightning strike, and there was a sound, so faint he almost missed it, coming from somewhere beneath his feet. A humming, a vibration that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, its own life. Thomas McReady was about to discover that sometimes the thing that saves you is the very thing that scares you the most. Sometimes the answer to your prayers comes in a form so unexpected, so impossible, that you almost don't recognize it as a blessing. What happened next would not only change Thomas's life forever, but would also remind everyone who heard his story that miracles don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they look like problems. Sometimes they look like mysteries. And sometimes they look like the strangest, most terrifying thing you've ever seen. Are you ready to find out what Thomas discovered that morning? Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at the ground beneath your feet the same way again. Before we dive deeper into Thomas McReady's incredible story, I want you to do something for me. Look around you right now. Look at the walls, the floor, the ceiling above your head. Now imagine losing all of it. Imagine watching everything you've worked for your entire life slowly slip away, day by day, bill by bill, prayer by unanswered prayer. That's exactly where Thomas found himself in the summer of 2024. And if you're someone who believes that sometimes life has a way of surprising us when we need it most, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to sharing true stories of hope, faith, and unexpected miracles that happen to ordinary people just like you and me. Thomas McReady lived in what most people would call the middle of nowhere. His farm sat on a dirt road 30 minutes outside the small town of Greenville, Alabama, population 7,800. The nearest grocery store was a 20-minute drive, and the nearest hospital was over an hour away. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where people still waved at strangers and where a man's word was worth more than any contract, but knowing your neighbors doesn't pay the bills. And in rural Alabama, where factory jobs had disappeared and small farms struggled to compete with massive corporate agriculture, good intentions couldn't feed a family. Thomas had inherited the farm from his grandfather, a tough old man named Earl McReady, who had somehow managed to make the land profitable for over 50 years. Earl had grown cotton, corn, soybeans, and raised cattle. He'd employed half a dozen workers during harvest season and had enough money saved to send Thomas's father to college. The McReady farm had been a pillar of the community, a place where neighbors came to borrow tools and share meals during planting season. But that was before the drought, before the trade wars that made soybeans worthless, before the bank started calling every month, asking about overdue mortgage payments, before Thomas's wife, Sarah, started working double shifts at the diner in town just to keep the electricity on. Thomas was 43 years old, but he looked older. Years of working under the brutal Alabama sun had weathered his face like old leather. His hands were permanently stained with dirt and motor oil, scarred from countless cuts and scrapes that came with fixing broken equipment with no money for proper parts. He stood 6 feet tall but seemed smaller, as if the weight of constant worry had literally bent his shoulders forward. Every morning, Thomas would walk out to his fields and survey the damage. 90-degree temperatures by 8 a.m., cracked earth that looked more like concrete than soil, withered plants that never had a chance. He'd started each of the last 3 growing seasons with hope, borrowing money for seeds and fertilizer, convinced that this would be the year things turned around. This would be the year the rains came. This would be the year the McReady farm came back to life. But by July every year, that hope had turned to desperation. By August, desperation had turned to resignation. And by September, Thomas would be standing in his kitchen, staring at a pile of bills he couldn't pay, wondering if he should just call the bank himself and save them the trouble of foreclosure. Sarah never complained, not once. She would kiss him goodbye every morning at 5 a.m. before her shift at the diner, and she would kiss him hello every evening at 9 p.m. when she finally came home, exhausted and smelling like bacon grease and coffee. In between, she served truckers and farmers and construction workers, smiling even when they left no tip, because every dollar mattered. Every single dollar. Their 2 children, Emma and Jake, ages 14 and 12, had learned not to ask for things. Not for new school clothes, not for money for field trips, not for the latest video games their friends had. They'd learned to say maybe next month when friends invited them to movies or bowling, because next month never seemed to come. Thomas's neighbors tried to help when they could. Jim Patterson, who owned the farm to the north, would sometimes accidentally plant too much corn and need help harvesting it, paying Thomas cash for work that probably didn't need doing. Maria Santos, whose family ran a small grocery store in town, would slip extra items into Thomas's bags and somehow forget to charge for them. But pride is a difficult thing, especially for a man whose father and grandfather had been respected landowners, and Thomas struggled with accepting charity even from friends. The irony wasn't lost on him that his family was going hungry while living on 80 acres of some of the most potentially fertile farmland in Alabama. The soil was good. It just needed rain. The location was perfect. It just needed luck. Thomas had the knowledge, the work ethic, and the determination to make the farm profitable again. What he didn't have was time. The bank had been patient for 3 years, but patience has limits, and those limits were measured in monthly payments that Thomas couldn't make. He'd considered selling, of course. Real estate developers from Birmingham had driven out twice, measuring the land, talking about strip malls and housing developments. They'd offered enough money to pay off the mortgage and maybe have a little left over. But the thought of watching bulldozers tear up his grandfather's legacy made Thomas physically sick. Some nights, lying in bed listening to Sarah's exhausted breathing, Thomas would pray. Not the formal prayers he'd learned in Sunday school, but desperate, honest conversations with whatever force might be listening. He'd ask for rain. He'd ask for a good harvest. He'd ask for just one break, one stroke of luck, one sign that all his hard work and faith meant something. But the sky stayed clear. The fields stayed barren, and the bills kept coming. Thomas McReady was a man who had run out of options, a man who had tried everything he knew how to try, a man who was about to lose the only life he'd ever known. He was also, though he didn't know it yet, a man who was exactly where he needed to be to receive the most extraordinary gift of his life. That morning, as Thomas approached the strange markings in his field with his flashlight beam dancing across the geometric patterns, he noticed something that made him stop breathing for a moment. The marks weren't just on the surface. They were burned into the earth, scorched, as if something incredibly hot had pressed down on the soil with tremendous force, leaving behind these perfect, impossible designs. But here's what really made Thomas's heart race. In the center of the largest circle, something was reflecting his flashlight beam back at him. Something metallic. Something that definitely hadn't been there yesterday when he'd walked this same field, hoping against hope to find some sign that his corn might still survive the drought. Thomas knelt down beside the markings, his knees sinking into the hard-packed earth. Up close, he could see that whatever had created these patterns had also changed the soil itself. The normally red Alabama clay had turned almost black, and it felt different under his fingers. Softer, more fertile, more alive. It was as if the earth had been recharged somehow. The metallic object was partially buried, maybe 6 inches down, and as Thomas brushed away the loose soil, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a piece of farm equipment. It wasn't debris from someone's trash. It was a box. A metal box about the size of a shoebox, but heavier than anything that size had a right to be. And it was warm. Not hot, but definitely warmer than the morning air around it. Thomas lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight, and immediately noticed that it had no visible seams, no hinges, no way to open it that he could see. The surface was perfectly smooth, almost mirror-like, and covered in symbols that looked like nothing he'd ever seen before. Not letters, not numbers, but intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. As he held the box in his hands, that humming sound he'd noticed earlier grew stronger. It wasn't coming from the box exactly. It was coming from everywhere, from the ground beneath his feet, from the air around him, even from inside his own chest. It was a frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep in his bones, something primal and ancient. And then, just as the first rays of sunlight began to creep across the horizon, something even stranger happened. The dead corn stalks around him, plants that had been brown and brittle for weeks, began to move, not swaying in the wind because there was no wind, moving with purpose as if they were slowly, impossibly coming back to life. Thomas rubbed his eyes, convinced he was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress. Farmers didn't find mysterious boxes in their fields. Crops didn't resurrect themselves overnight. These things happened in movies, in books, in the wild stories that old-timers told at the coffee shop in town. They didn't happen to broke farmers in rural Alabama. But when he looked again, the corn stalks were definitely greener, and the soil around the strange markings was darker, richer, and the box in his hands was definitely real, definitely warm, definitely humming with some kind of energy that made his fingertips tingle. Thomas's practical mind tried to find rational explanations. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. Maybe this was some kind of art project gone wrong. Maybe he was having a stress-induced breakdown and none of this was actually happening. But as he stood there in the growing daylight, watching his dying crop slowly transform before his eyes, rational explanations seemed increasingly inadequate. The cattle had calmed down now, but they were all standing at the edge of their pen, staring directly at Thomas and the strange markings. Not grazing, not moving, just watching with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Animals knew things, Thomas's grandfather had always said. They could sense storms coming days before humans noticed the first clouds. They could feel earthquakes before the ground started shaking. And right now, his cattle were acting like they could sense something that Thomas couldn't quite understand. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas realized he had a choice to make. He could take the box back to the house, show it to Sarah, maybe drive into town and ask someone if they'd ever seen anything like it. He could treat this like a curiosity, a strange morning that would make a good story someday. Or he could stay. He could try to understand what was happening. He could investigate further. The responsible thing would be to go home, to forget about mysterious boxes and impossible corn plants and geometric patterns burned into his field, to focus on real problems, like how he was going to make the mortgage payment at the end of the month. But as Thomas held the warm metal box and watched the morning light reveal more changes in his field, patches of green where everything had been brown, rich soil where everything had been dust, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the time for being responsible. Maybe this was the time for believing in something bigger than his problems. The humming was getting stronger now, and Thomas could swear he heard something else underneath it. Not exactly voices, but something like music, something like singing, something that made him think of Sunday mornings in his grandmother's church, when the whole congregation would lift their voices together and create something beautiful out of all their individual struggles and hopes. Thomas made his decision. Instead of heading back to the house, he sat down right there in the middle of the strange markings, the mysterious box in his lap, and waited. For what, he wasn't sure. For answers, maybe. For explanations. For whatever force had created these patterns to reveal itself. What he didn't expect was for the box to suddenly become lighter in his hands. Not weightless, but definitely lighter, as if whatever was inside it was somehow responding to his presence, his decision to stay and investigate. And what he definitely didn't expect was for the smooth, seamless surface of the box to suddenly develop a hairline crack right down the middle, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, exactly this person, exactly this level of faith and curiosity to finally reveal its secrets. Thomas McReady was about to discover that some mysteries don't solve themselves, some mysteries require courage, and some mysteries change everything. The crack in the box began to widen, accompanied by a sound like glass wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Thomas held his breath, his calloused farmer's hands trembling slightly as he felt the metal surface growing warmer and somehow more alive under his touch. Whatever was inside wanted out, and every instinct Thomas had developed from 43 years of hard living told him to run. But he didn't run. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was just the stubborn McReady blood that had kept his family on this land for 3 generations, despite every obstacle life had thrown at them. Instead of running, Thomas leaned closer. The crack spread across the box's surface in a pattern that seemed deliberate, purposeful, like fractures in ice that follow the laws of physics but create something unexpectedly beautiful. And as the first piece of metal fell away, Thomas saw light. Not reflected light from the morning sun, but light that seemed to be generated from within the box itself, warm, golden light that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, full of love and possibility, and the promise of something good about to happen. "Thomas, Thomas, where are you?" Sarah's voice carried across the fields from the direction of the house. Worried and sharp, she'd obviously discovered his empty bed and was looking for him. In 30 minutes she'd need to leave for her shift at the diner, and she always insisted on saying goodbye, no matter how early or how tired she was. Thomas looked toward the sound of his wife's voice, then back at the opening box in his hands. The smart thing to do would be to call out to her, to share this impossible moment with the woman who'd stood by him through 3 years of failure and disappointment. But something held him back. Not secrecy exactly, but a sense that whatever was happening here needed to happen first to him alone. That this was his moment, his test, his chance to prove worthy of whatever gift or curse was about to be revealed. "I'm checking the cattle," he called back, his voice carrying easily across the still morning air. "Everything's fine. See you tonight." He heard Sarah's footsteps crunching through the gravel as she headed back to the house, probably shaking her head at her husband's tendency to worry about livestock that were perfectly capable of taking care of themselves. If only she knew what he was really looking at right now. As more pieces of the metal box fell away, dissolving rather than breaking, Thomas could see something inside that made him question his sanity all over again. It wasn't treasure in any conventional sense. It wasn't money or gold or precious stones. It was seeds, hundreds of seeds, each one glowing with that same warm, inner light. But these weren't like any seeds Thomas had ever seen in 30 years of farming. They were perfectly spherical, about the size of marbles, and they seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. More than that, Thomas could somehow sense what they were. Not intellectually, but instinctively. The way he could look at a cow and know if it was sick, or look at the sky and know if rain was coming. These seeds carried the potential for something extraordinary, something that would grow faster and stronger and more abundantly than anything in nature had a right to. As the last pieces of the box dissolved completely, leaving only the seeds floating in Thomas's cupped palms, he heard a vehicle approaching down the dirt road that led to his farm. Not Sarah leaving for work. This was coming from the opposite direction. This was someone coming to visit, and at 6:30 in the morning, unexpected visitors usually meant bad news. Thomas quickly gathered the glowing seeds into his shirt pocket, surprised to find that their light immediately dimmed, as if they understood the need for discretion. The geometric patterns in the soil around him were already fading too, becoming harder to see as the morning light grew stronger. Whatever had happened here was beginning to hide itself, leaving behind only the inexplicable improvement in his crops, as evidence that anything unusual had occurred at all. The approaching vehicle turned out to be a black pickup truck that Thomas recognized immediately. It belonged to Richard Hawkins, the bank manager who'd been handling Thomas's mortgage for the past 3 years. Richard was a decent man trapped in an indecent job, someone who clearly hated having to threaten foreclosure on neighbors and friends, but who also had a responsibility to his institution and his shareholders. Thomas walked toward the farmhouse, trying to look casual despite the fact that his heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. The magical seeds felt warm against his chest, almost alive, and he found himself wondering if Richard would be able to sense that something had changed, if somehow the banker would look at Thomas and know that everything was about to be different. "Morning, Thomas," Richard called out as he stepped down from his truck. He was wearing his usual uniform of khakis and a button-down shirt, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Sorry to bother you so early, but I was hoping we could talk." "Richard," Thomas nodded, noticing that his neighbor's cattle were still watching him intently from their pen. "What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid it's what I need to do for you," Richard said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The bank's regional manager was here yesterday. He's been reviewing all our agricultural loans and, well, Thomas, I'm running out of ways to buy you more time. If you can't make some kind of payment by the end of this month, I'm going to have to start foreclosure proceedings." Thomas felt the seeds grow warmer in his pocket, as if they were responding to his emotional state. End of the month. That gave him 26 days to figure out how to save his farm. 26 days to turn the most impossible morning of his life into some kind of solution. "I understand," Thomas said quietly. "You've been more than fair, Richard. More patient than anyone had a right to expect. I wish there was another way," the banker said, and Thomas could tell he meant it. "You're good people, Thomas. You and Sarah both. This whole situation it's not right." As Richard drove away, leaving Thomas standing alone in his farmyard with impossible seeds burning warm against his heart, one thought kept echoing in his mind. 26 days. He had 26 days to discover what these seeds could do, and whether the strangest morning of his life was about to become his salvation. That evening, after Sarah had left for her night shift and the children were asleep, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He took one of the glowing seeds from his pocket and planted it in a small plot behind the house, far enough from the main fields that nobody would notice if something unusual happened. He watered it with well water, said a quiet prayer, and went to bed wondering if he'd lost his mind completely. When he woke up the next morning, Thomas thought he was still dreaming. Where he had planted a single seed, a fully mature corn plant now stood 8 feet tall, heavy with ears that were already ready for harvest. Not just any corn. This was the most perfect corn Thomas had ever seen, with kernels so full and golden they seemed to glow in the morning light. One seed had produced more corn than some of his fields had yielded in entire seasons. But that wasn't the most incredible part. The most incredible part was that the soil around the plant had transformed completely. The hard-packed, drought-stricken earth had become rich and dark and moist, as if the plant had somehow healed the land itself. A circle of fertility about 10 feet in diameter, where everything touched by the plant's influence had been restored to perfect growing condition. Thomas harvested that first ear of corn with hands that shook with anticipation and disbelief. When he husked it, he discovered that each kernel was filled with seeds, dozens of them, each one carrying the same warm glow as the original. One magical seed had become hundreds of magical seeds overnight. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas worked with a precision and secrecy he'd never needed before. Each night after his family was asleep, he would plant more seeds in carefully planned locations around his property. Each morning, he would wake to find mature plants surrounded by circles of restored soil, corn, soybeans, cotton, even vegetables he'd never successfully grown in Alabama soil. Everything flourished beyond his wildest dreams. But Thomas was smart enough to know that miracles attracted attention, and attention was the last thing he needed right now. So he planted strategically, mixing the magical crops with normal ones, creating the appearance of a gradual, natural recovery rather than an overnight transformation. To anyone driving by, it would look like the McCready farm was simply having a better year than usual. Good, but not impossible. The hardest part was keeping the secret from Sarah and the children. Every morning Sarah would comment on how much better the fields looked, how much more confident Thomas seemed, how maybe they should start thinking positively about the future again. Thomas wanted desperately to tell her everything, to share the impossible joy of knowing that their farm was saved, that their family was secure, that the days of going to bed hungry were over forever. But something held him back. Maybe it was superstition, the fear that talking about a miracle might make it disappear. Maybe it was caution, the knowledge that some people wouldn't understand, wouldn't believe, might even try to take away whatever force was healing his land. Or maybe it was just the farmer's instinct to wait until harvest time to count your blessings. 23 days after finding the mysterious box, Thomas walked his fields in the pre-dawn darkness, surveying what had become the most productive farm in 3 counties. Where once there had been dust and failure, now there were plants heavy with fruit, vegetables ready for market, and soil so rich and dark it looked like chocolate cake. The transformation was so complete, so perfect, that even Thomas sometimes wondered if he'd dreamed the whole thing. But then he would reach into his pocket and feel the remaining seeds, still warm, still glowing softly in his palm, and he would know that whatever had happened to him was real. On the morning of the 24th day, Thomas was walking through his transformed fields when he heard vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles moving fast down his dirt road. His first thought was that someone had discovered his secret, that somehow word had gotten out about the impossible recovery of the McCready farm. But when the vehicles came into view, Thomas realized the situation was much worse than exposure. It was Richard Hawkins, but he wasn't alone. Behind his pickup truck were 2 other vehicles. A car with government plates and a van that Thomas recognized as belonging to the Agricultural Extension Office. Thomas met them in his farmyard, his heart pounding as he tried to appear calm and casual. In his pocket, the remaining seeds seemed to grow warmer, as if they sensed danger. "Morning, Thomas," Richard said, but his usual apologetic demeanor was gone. Behind him stood 2 men in suits and a woman with a clipboard who was already photographing Thomas's fields with obvious amazement. "Richard," Thomas nodded. "What brings you out here with such a crowd?" "Satellite imagery," one of the suit-wearing men said without introduction. "We've been monitoring crop yields across the region for insurance purposes, and your farm has been flagged for investigation. According to our data, you've somehow increased your productivity by over 3,000% in the past 3 weeks. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "I don't know anything about satellites. I just know that we've had some good luck with the weather lately." "Mr. McGreedy," the woman with the clipboard said, her voice professional but not unkind. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the USDA. What we're seeing here isn't just good luck. This level of crop recovery in drought conditions isn't scientifically possible without some form of enhancement. We need to understand what's happening on your land." Thomas looked around at the group of officials, at his beautiful, impossible fields, at the life he'd built that was about to be taken away from him one way or another. In his pocket, the seeds were growing almost hot now, and he could swear he heard that humming sound again, faint but definitely there. "I think," Thomas said slowly, making the most important decision of his life, "there's something you all need to see." As he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the glowing seeds, Thomas realized that the time for secrecy was over. The time for hiding miracles was over. The time for being afraid of what people might think or do was over. It was time for the world to know that sometimes when everything seems lost, the universe has a way of providing exactly what you need, in exactly the form you need it, even if that form is impossible to explain. As Thomas held up that glowing seed in the morning sunlight, everything went perfectly still. The officials stopped talking. The birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the entire world was holding its breath to witness what would happen next. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. "Mr. McGreedy," she whispered, her scientific training warring with what her eyes were telling her. "What exactly are you holding?" Thomas looked at the seed in his palm, then at the faces around him, some skeptical, some amazed, all completely focused on this impossible moment. "I honestly don't know," he said. 3 weeks ago, I found a box in my field. Inside were seeds like this one. They grow overnight into perfect crops, and they heal the soil wherever they're planted." Richard Hawkins stepped forward, his banker's mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Thomas, are you telling me that your entire crop recovery is due to, what, alien seeds? Magic beans?" "I'm telling you what I know," Thomas replied calmly. "I planted these seeds and they saved my farm. They saved my family. And maybe they can do more than that. What happened over the next 6 months changed everything, not just for Thomas McGreedy, but for agriculture around the world. The seeds were studied, analyzed, and tested by the best scientific minds available. Nobody could explain how they worked, but nobody could deny that they did work. One seed could transform an acre of barren land into the most productive soil on Earth overnight. Thomas became the guardian of what scientists eventually called the Alabama phenomenon. The original seeds multiplied endlessly, each plant producing hundreds more seeds with the same miraculous properties. Within a year, Drought-stricken farms across the American South were being restored. Within 2 years, the technology was helping feed hungry populations around the world. Thomas never became wealthy from his discovery. He insisted that the seeds be shared freely with anyone who needed them. But his farm became profitable again, his family became secure, and the McReady name became synonymous with hope for struggling farmers everywhere. The bank? They tore up Thomas's mortgage completely and issued a formal apology for ever doubting him. Richard Hawkins left banking and became Thomas's partner in distributing the miracle seeds to farmers who needed them most. Sarah still works at the diner, but now it's because she wants to, not because she has to. Emma and Jake are both studying agricultural science in college, determined to understand the scientific principles behind their father's miracle and to continue his work of helping others. But here's what I think is the most important part of Thomas McReady's story. He never stopped believing that he was worthy of a miracle, even when everything around him suggested otherwise. He never stopped working, never stopped caring for his land, never stopped having faith that somehow, some way, things could get better. And when his miracle finally came, it didn't come in the form he expected. It came as a mystery, as something frightening and impossible that required courage to investigate and wisdom to share. If Thomas's story has inspired you, if it's reminded you that miracles can happen to ordinary people in extraordinary moments, then I want you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to sharing true stories of hope, faith, and the incredible ways that life can surprise us when we need it most. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their situation can change, that their struggles are not permanent, that sometimes the universe is just waiting for the right moment to provide exactly what we need. Thomas McReady's story reminds us that we never know what tomorrow might bring. We never know when our greatest challenge might become our greatest blessing. And we never know when we might be called upon to be the guardian of something miraculous that's meant to help, not just ourselves, but everyone around us. Sometimes the earth itself whispers secrets to those who truly listen. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to listen back, those secrets can change the world. The question is, are you listening?